You got to remember that my whole teaching program has emerged out of the teaching itself. So I remember when I first came into religious studies as a newly minted PhD, I was directionless because after being so focused on my specialization, I knew squat about how to address students who were being introduced to a subject matter. So it meant taking a step back, introducing students to, whatever it is that you do, your specialization, which means, of course, that you have to acquire a skill to do that. And you don't come out of graduate school with that skill already in place. You basically learn it. You learn it. And why? Well, because usually it's the context that is going to determine that for you. Sometimes when you're stuck in a room studying your particular subject matter, you become closed off to the pressing issues that students bring to it, whatever it is that they're studying. And I know there's people that do it as majors and some that do it as, just taking it as an elective. They don't really give a shit. But the thing is that they're there, and this is precious time in their lives. And you have to take a step back and allow that context to furnish the background of the information you will pitch. And that was always very, I don't know, it was like an anchor on my soul. I always felt like, what am I teaching them? Why am I disrupting their whole universe of being? With some of these questions, a lot of students come into an area and they feel they've already, or it's not that they feel they've already answered the big questions, but they're looking for concrete answers to resolve a lot of their existential anxieties and stuff like that. And here I am, just making it more and more problematic for them. So I'm trying to take a step back and allowing that to furnish a point of contact of meaning with regard to my teaching. Okay, so I don't want to go too far into that, but just to say that my research program emerged out of teaching. I did not particularly like teaching. Teaching was just a huge anxiety because you always had to prove the significance of what you teach. Because people that come to your classes don't necessarily have an interest in what you're doing. But I don't like that because I have to face students all the time and feel this alienation that they have. And so it weighed very heavily on me. So I tried to come up with a way of making philosophy type interests interesting. And so I had to come up with some sort of program for mediating my own specialized interests in a very general context. And so that specialized thing for me was the notion of subjectivity, the notion of the subject. And I was reared on this in graduate school. I was trained in Bernard Lonergan's thought. And when I came into graduate school, that was considered passé. So basically, I spent a few years of my life studying something that was worthless to contemporary scholarship. Of course, that meant I had to read more broadly again and figure out what people were talking about when it came to this notion of subjectivity and why it somehow disrupted my own kind of work in subjectivity and the thought of this individual. So, through the kind of accidents of history and how things fall together, I basically had to make the plan. So how do I mediate philosophy, the notion of subjectivity, in a religious studies context where students don't necessarily have a philosophical interest? They're not, and in fact, they may even have an antipathy toward philosophy. But that didn't help me when I was teaching philosophy of religion and religious studies. So I had to come up with a way that a student who had no interest in philosophy and formalized concepts of the subject and topics of theological interest, how to both teach them something concrete, namely what philosophy of religion is, while making it worth their while. So part of my program started with this notion of subjectivity. That was my specialization. I did quite a bit of work on the notion of subjectivity in a variety of different scholars, which allowed me to feel the weight of the contemporary disenchantment with subjective talk. But at the same time, I always had this appreciation for what Bernard Lonergan taught about it. But I knew that the way he pitched that valuable program simply did not have any kind of anchorage in religious studies. I mean, nobody in philosophy of religion or religious studies invokes the name of Lonergan. That proved a great disappointment to me. So I poured a lot of energy into that. So basically, as I write in that blog that I asked you to read for today, was coming up with a term that would allow me to speak meaningfully to my colleagues and also present some new challenges to students to reconceive the notion of subjectivity according to contemporary ideas about it. Anyway, the term was enecstasis that I came up with. And it was, as I say in that blog, my X that marks the spot. Create a term that would allow you to develop a space for thinking about this reality we're all interested in, namely ourselves, the self, and come up with some way of positioning that with respect to religious studies. My pressing issue was how to present something to students that was worthwhile studying and how to let them see that as a point of self-discovery. If you look at that blog, it kind of broached with a lot of overlapping things, like for me, the need to be attuned to oneself and the responsibility of that call for self. And at the same time, having to deal with students who had specialized interest in, say, religions in a specific part of the world concerning their practices and beliefs, just acquiring that knowledge. And yet, facing this divide, I had to kind of step in such a way that I would teach students something called philosophy of religion, but in a general way. That's why I call it philosophy of religious studies. Nobody talks about philosophy of religious studies. People talk about philosophy of religion, by which they mean typically the various branches of philosophizing that fall under analytic and continental approaches that we've been talking about. And then sometimes it will overlap with themes like the existence of God, the problem of evil, or, phenomenological interests in religious systems of meaning. Okay, so it would be very specialized and concentrated stuff. I talk about philosophy of religious studies because I'm taking a distance from that kind of philosophy of religion. I don't think it speaks to everybody in religious studies who thinks relatively critically and philosophically, theologically, and whatnot. I speak about philosophy of religious studies as a bridge to discussing the history of the development of thought on religion. Right? What we've been discussing in this class is the second order tradition. That became the subject matter. This was my way of providing a topic for students to study while they engage in a critical self-reflexivity that we've been talking about. So the subject matter, second order tradition of religious studies, the specialization, which has emerged since the 19th century, and look at the various philosophical orientations of all of these individuals in that tradition as an opportunity to negotiate the self. And I learned quite a bit from both the new materialists who were critiquing the phenomenological approach, and also people like Tyler Roberts that we discussed last time, who were criticizing the developments of the new materialist approaches. And I thought to myself, what a wonderful opportunity to introduce students to contemporary issues of theorizing religion in academia that broach normative type questions, right, in academia. So how do we feel about the phenomenological program? How do we feel about what phenomenologists were saying about the social scientific approach to the study of religion? These are brimming with normative questions surrounding what should the proper approach be? What kind of critical and philosophical questions should we raise in this context? What a perfect way of formalizing a program that I call philosophy of religious studies, which is not a negotiation of what students of religion are predominantly interested in, namely the beliefs, practices, and things like that of religions, but it turns the gaze on the scholars who mediate that knowledge, right? The second order tradition. And to do that in such a way that is not philosophically disengaged, but is actually involved in a negotiation of both the history, the ideas, whether they're being mediated properly, and also their impact on our current self-understanding. Like, how do I feel about them? What do I think about, let's say, a dialectical discussion about the history? What does this have to say to me? How does it form me? How does it influence my way of thinking? What is my stance with respect to this second order tradition? It becomes a very self-conscious, philosophical engagement with practical intent. Many people say, philosophy is just so disconnected, and I'm just going to learn about logic and some person's system, which is highly specialized. I don't have time for that. And to a certain extent, I think if you don't have the interest, it's true, you don't have time for that. But you certainly have time in the context of academia to be critically aware of certain types of engagement, that is relevant to you. No, I'm not going to teach you about various Bhakti movements in a specific geopolitical context, or Christianity in Africa and things like this. All very important research. But my job, you remember, as a philosopher of religion, is to engage students of religion in these fundamental methodological theoretical concerns. So that's what I mean by philosophy of religious studies, and how wonderful that it overlaps with the second order tradition that I've outlined, especially stage 4, right? Stage 4 as a kind of critical reflexivity with regard to scholarship, or scholars who mediate this knowledge, what their assumptions are, what their presuppositions are, how it impacts what they believe they objectively mediate, or subjectively mediate, depending on what side of the spectrum you're on. But the idea is negotiating at that level. For me, a general philosophy of religious studies involves students of religion in a critical inquiry about the assumptions of scholarship in religious studies. I think everyone can do that. I think everyone can be invited to participate in that kind of discussion without committing them to the highly specialized discourses of philosophy itself. I'm not here to make you Hegelians or Kantians or Iliadians or things of that nature. I am here to get you to reflect upon this history specific to religious studies as an occasion to consider yourself, the self involved in that kind of enterprise. I attach the term enecstatic to that to flag the meta-methodological nature of what I do. Enecstatic philosophy of religious studies for me is an explicit interest in the theoretical underpinnings that scholars attend to, like, say, complex religious language, like theories of religion. But more importantly for me, as an ecstatic, the subject so invited to be engaged. To make that explicit, what's happening when I'm doing that to myself? How am I feeling? Am I allowed? Do I have a voice? Can I formalize these things to myself? Do I have to reject Descartes? Do I have to reject Kant? Do I have to reject Hegel? Do I embrace, some radically disparate anti-subjectivistic discourses surrounding whatever it is that we're talking about? That's the thing for me that enecstatic philosophy of religious studies entails. Right? It's this opening for a discussion about the theoretical underpinnings of an object of study called religion, specifically in the second order tradition, and also this self-conscious self-critical reflexivity so involved. For me, that's how the two correlate in my mind, in my own work. Yeah. Enecstasis was my term of bewilderment, basically, at the current state of discussion about subjectivity. I was being shut down all the time when I wanted to talk about the importance of this kind of self-reflexivity, given, let's say, the post-structuralist stance regarding the subject. Anytime you talk about the subject, they think, oh my God, here we go, Descartes again, here we go, Kant again, and all of this stuff. Which is fine, but I think it has to be negotiated. In any case, I had to settle the score. I had to somehow say, listen, fuck it. There is everybody who has different opinions about this. There are specialized discourse about this and that and the other things surrounding the subject. I'm going to throw in my term now to formalize my own stance, to formalize what I feel is of value in a religious studies environment. So enecstasis was my term, and I got it as a reformulation of Heidegger's term extatikon, 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 ecstatic, which he gave an ontological significance to. That is, in light of his own programmatic concerns, to help us with our forgetfulness of being. Like, that was his program, right? All of this talk about subjectivity, scientific objectivity, etc., we have forgotten the call of being. And so Heidegger proposes an existential analytic to help us somehow catch glimpses of being in its manifestations as event. He called it extatikon as a way of pointing to engaged thinking about the common, about the everyday. But he was insistent that it had to be fundamental ontology. The preoccupation with entities, namely what sciences are interested in, have basically cut us off from an understanding of being. I was looking to Heidegger because he became a formidable, pioneering individual who talks about being in an anti-Cartesian way. I wanted to show here you have an anti-Cartesian who's still talking about what we might classify as a subjective interest. He's calling us away from the objectivist mentality of the West and trying to get us to connect with the call of being again. So I came across this section where he talks about extatikon as a form of care. So like I say here in that blog that I gave you, the way that language transmits the call of being in Heidegger's Destruction of the scientific subjectum can still manage a concern like the care of ecstatic Dasein. Ecstatic, and so this is coming back now to your question, finally, right? The care of ecstatic Dasein, which is a standing in the openness of being, of enduring and outstanding in care. It's crazy, right? I know it's very abstract. But again, a standing in the openness of being, that is where agency finds itself in the view that being is the proper agency of this caring. Being, Sein, is first, if you like, in the discussion. But Dasein, this, he doesn't use the term subject, subjectum, use the term Dasein, that being which is thrown into existence. Standing in the openness of being gives the precedence to being of this Dasein, enduring and outstanding, like standing out, waiting for the manifestations, the revelations of being, if you like, but standing in this care. So, you know, this play on in and out, in and out. Dasein in, standing out for the revelation of being. I took the form of this orientation And I did this neologism to flag the fact that what I want to talk about is something post-Heideggerian, something general enough to be respectfully indebted to Heidegger, but at the same time, transcending Heidegger in the current post-structuralist conversation, where Heidegger is somebody to be overcome. So for me, enecstasis then, when I take that term, being in and out, like being in the sense of engaged, and out being in the sense of receptive, Greek prepositions that I put together in front of stasis. Stasis is standing. So in and out standing in a post-Heideggerian context where the dynamic changes from fundamental ontology to a preoccupation again with entities. I'm trying to avoid technical terminology. For Heidegger, it would be the difference between ontic sciences and ontological sciences, where the ontological is always subverting the ontic. The ontic is any science, physics, I don't know, metaphysics, whatever it is in the West, concerned with beings. I wanted to reintroduce this notion of care and to tie it to the ontic preoccupation of the sciences. So like religious studies is an ontic science. Why? Because it formalizes itself on the basis of an object called religion. For Heidegger, this is secondary and something that reveals in his fundamental ontology the call of being. But that discourse, ontic discourse, cannot serve as a basis for negotiating what he calls fundamental ontological concerns. So I wanted to detach from Heidegger's specialized approach to this question and come up with a term that would give me the freedom to do that. Because as you know, I'm also partly Derridian. I don't think we can escape our language. I don't think we can just simply say, well, forget Heidegger, I'll just do it my way now. I think that we're tied to the language. And so I found an opening in Heidegger's existential concern with being, but now bringing it into a preoccupation with that concern in the ontic sciences. Like, how do we negotiate the concrete subjects? Okay, so that's all very abstract. But so for me, the reason why I continue with that term is because I want to suggest that the problem is technical. But when I talk about my preoccupation, I tend to not talk about it in terms of enecstasis, right? Because that doesn't mean anything to you unless you know Heidegger and Derrida and Foucault and people like that. So what I prefer to do is just talk about it generally as philosophy of religious studies. Philosophy of religious studies now, which becomes an explicit ontic preoccupation for the negotiation of dialectical and foundational concerns in religious studies. If you look at that last chapter, you'll see that I surfaced two terms from the work of Bernard Lonergan that I've mentioned, dialectic and foundations. Dialectic is what Lonergan calls a functional specialization in the study, well, for him, anything, but he was predominantly interested in theology, with mediating the scholar's mediation of a past. Dialectic is that kind of critical involvement, pinpointing issues in, say, the work of history or interpretation. Foundations is something else. Foundations takes place mostly after dialectic, because foundations talks about one's orientation, one's worldview, one's stance in life. So when you bring together dialectic foundations together, dialectic gives you the content, the subject matter, and foundations is concerned with a decision concerning what has been mediated. How am I going to be mediating it in the present? And at the heart of both in Lonergan's system is the consciousness of the subject doing the dialectical and foundational work. You know, I'm speaking very generally about this. There are very technical ways in which you can talk about it, but I'm just trying to flag those key terms that help me in my construction of what I call philosophy of religious studies, which has both an object and subject constitutive orientation. And this is where I can bring together some of the things I've talked about with regard to Tyler Roberts, who is, for me, serving as an important interlocutor in the development of what I call philosophy of religious studies. I want you to see philosophy of religious studies as something specific for students of religion to care about in a stage 4 setting, negotiating all the philosophical debates that we've been exposed to in this seminar, right back to Schleiermacher, from phenomenologists through to the new materialists. And philosophy of religious studies, it's philosophy after all, overlaps with Tyler Roberts' interest in the humanities. What is the role of philosophical reflection now in religious studies that is not, strictly speaking, social scientific? It relies on a lot of the developments we've been tracking in the social sciences, but it doesn't work within that, coming up with a philosophy, because it subjects the philosophy guiding the social sciences to critique or self-critical reflexivity. Right? It's what allowed us to see in the new materialist viewpoint a blind spot in terms of their philosophical presuppositions. You cannot bring religious discourse into a conversation of religion because you're already biasing an outsider and an insider with respect to these fundamental concerns about, you know, what is the nature of God, sunyata, and all of these kinds of questions, the normative stuff that Tyler Roberts was talking to us about last time. That's object constitutive because I find that it's interested more in coming up with a way of formalizing those beliefs and concepts in such a way that is conducive to critical self-reflexivity in religious studies. Now, for me, an ecstatic philosophy of religious studies is an explicit preoccupation with yourself, doing this work with yourself. In other words, an enecstatic philosophy of religion is more indirect and elusive than it is a system. That's why I talk about it in terms of singularity. The singularity of your experience, your knowledge, your worldview, having to critically mediate what you do in religious studies, not for an audience, not for your readers, not for your friends, but for you. It's an opportunity for you to make up your own mind about such things, to give you the opportunity to do that in a religious studies environment without committing you to new materialism or phenomenology or whatever else it is that we've been looking at. That's why I talk about the self of enecstasis as a singularity. The person that you're becoming in the work that you're doing. It allows you that opportunity to bring yourself into the spotlight rather than just itemizing the things you've learned. Enecstasis gets you to think about the subject constitutive nature of the preoccupation. And it's something only you can do. It's not something I can do for you or some other professor or whoever, right? It's subject constitutive in that sense, in that there is the self, you, an irreducible self that accompanies whatever experiences you have, whatever knowledge you acquire. An enecstatic philosophy of religious studies is the place within which one can do that for oneself. I'm not giving you the right to do it. I'm telling you that it's important work that you need to do with yourself as you're acquiring knowledge, as you're being confronted with somebody who tells you, well, if you're doing it this way, you're not doing it the right way. rather than just, giving them the finger and saying, I'll do it whatever way I want. It's a question of saying, I am going to consider whatever is being proposed to me, but in such a way that I give my own self-license to formalize it and to formulate it. It's that re-entry of the self into a negotiation of an object. It gives you the freedom, as it were, to say that there is a self accompanying these objects of study, and I can't let it go. It's the idiosyncratic nature of your appropriation of an object and also of yourself. I don't know if you guys caught that first line of the introduction that I gave you. It was like, a voice within whispers strangeness. It's that sense that when something connects, it does connect. And then you say, wow, I love that. Or because it's done this, and something doesn't connect, you say, no, that's not it at all. It's this kind of sense of being you that is confronted constantly by information and the need for a negotiation to take place in yourself about that, right? I can't tell you as a specialist, say in anthropology or history or whatever, how to implement that, because that involves your own experience, that involves an attentiveness to your own experience, and of course, your level of knowledge of that subject matter. It's something that is so individual that's why I talk about it in terms of singularity. This is how Roberts describes singularity, and I think it's kind of cool. Singularity basically amounts to a radical difference between you and your objects of study, if you like, a radical difference that exceeds all determinate forms of difference. It exceeds it. That is a matter of an excessive openness to the other as other, right? There's this constant elusiveness of a self that is being constructed in light of what you're learning. And not only that, but this, I think, acute awareness in any self-conscious being about the strangeness of things, the strangeness of what you're encountering in a discourse. I don't know if you guys feel it. I know that I sure as hell did. Enecstasis, at least in the context of religious studies, is an opportunity to make that a theme, let's say an object of analysis, yourself. It's subject constitutive. And the intonation of it is very post-structuralist. It's not trying to say, well, you got to buy into Descartes' system, or you got to buy into Kant and Hegel and everybody. It's just a simple acknowledgement that the self is a singularity that is even strange to the self. It's giving yourself the freedom to enter into the conversation as a full-bodied individual with individual concerns that mediate knowledge, not simply in terms of objective acquisition of things, but as somebody who is being constructed at the same time, and trying to do so in an open, responsible, self-critical fashion. So for me, when I talk about enecstatic philosophy of religious studies, I am pointing specifically to that prong of the engagement, which complements Roberts' preoccupation, but is something different still. It's kind of methodological disposition for the negotiation of subject and object. It's method. It's a method for me that's apropos for our times, and specifically in religious studies, where there is an opportunity to engage philosophically, theologically, metaphysically, and stuff like that. Otherwise, what would religious studies really have to offer that sociology, anthropology, history do not? This is kind of involved in the identity wars of religious studies, because I do think it's an identity question. What is religious studies? Who am I as a scholar of religion? And why am I in a religious studies program when I can just function just as well in a history program that touches on religion or some object called religion? What is it about religious studies that is unique? What does it bring? This is what phenomenologists were trying to answer. And so that's why I think that philosophy of religious studies is a development of that preoccupation without being limited by its legitimating tactics. I think that's about most of it, like in terms of what I try to bring to the table that's different from Roberts and tries to make explicit what is already implicit in Roberts. In many respects, I'm so on board with the analysis itself, but there's this something missing in terms of a methodological interest that I have as a philosopher of religion, tackling religious studies in its uncontainable variety of approaches.